This past week I've actually been in Hobart, and no, nothing happened apart from having a good time. We also had 2 grandsons with us. On the whole, it was a good time. We also took them to Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art, and I don't know if you've been there, but it is eye-opening, no less for teenage boys, let me add. I was fortunate in that my wife, who is an art critic, an art teacher, and has more knowledge than me about art, was able to point out a few things along the way. There is precious and ancient and valuable art sitting next to more recent, sometimes beautiful, often shocking, sometimes shocking, always causing us to rethink the juxtaposition that was often there, challenging us about what we previously thought was art or was politically correct. One grandson said, "Well, I'm certainly happier than all these artists." We had to assure him that there was also a bit of tongue-in-cheek, a playful sense about much of it, as well as trying to make some serious comments, and some of it was just there as art to reflect on and to look at. But like these works of art, and art more generally, it often does mirror back to us something about ourselves or about our society or perhaps about our human condition that disturbs us or does shake us a bit or just makes us go, ah. They reflect something about our culture, perhaps, usually, and who we are, causing us to question or rethink or just to enjoy, as I've said, or to behold. Sometimes they invite us into places of transcendence, often into introspection, humour. We're repelled by some we dislike, some we'd like to hang on our wall, and some we'd just like to get away from. But they are there also because, as I say, they reflect something about us, a human condition. In that sense, they're a bit like, sacrament, in that they contain something more that is there that we don't readily see or that invite us into, like a portal, into something more. Well, today's prophetic utterance and the image from Amos is similar to that in some ways. Amos chapter 7 describes a series of visions, and in the first and the second visions are about destruction, and Amos actually intercedes for Israel, asking for forgiveness, appealing to God's compassion. God relents, and so on. But the third and fourth vision begin and with less frightening sights than the first two, but in them, in this ongoing prophecy, God shows the prophet an ordinary situation. So, and this links the hearers to a sense of God's judgment. Maybe the next slide there. No, not that one. Oh, okay. I mustn't have put it up. So God's judgment. Now, judgment is not a comfortable word for us, is it? We moderns, we've rightly so, we've moved away from the judgmental theology that was often there in the first millennia, even in the Reformation. Some of that sense of grace was there because of the sense of God's wrath at the time, whereas now if you talk about God's wrath in most Christian circles, we've had enough of that. We know that our sense of God is bigger than just a wrathful God. So judgment doesn't sit too well with us. Now, realise that Amos is also talking to the people of God. So they're not very happy with him, are they, when he talks of judgment or brings images of judgment. Amos reports seeing the Lord standing next to a wall, probably the defensive wall of the city. That's right, it was the earlier image up there when we were reading Amos, and I thought it was coming back. He gives no description of the Lord other than what is described in the Hebrew, and the word there, Anak, he said, the Anak is held in his hand. Now, most interpreters read that as the plumb line, so the image of the plumb line, and the straight line, measuring whether the building was straight or crooked. But a number of scholars actually think that this word Anak means tin, even though most translators say plumb line. So the Lord measures the straightness of the wall with the plumb line, and even there, Amos is saying the walls are crooked. But if it is tin, then the corruption is even worse, because the tin can go just about any way they like, because it's not heavy. So what he's saying is, not only are your walls crooked, but you're not bothered to even check your plumb line, that it might be right and straight, because a piece of tin is rather light. So that his sense of what's going on at the time is one of judgment, and something needs to happen. Now realise also that Amos at the time is talking during a period of relative wealth. Even so, he saw that even in that time of wealth, there were many among them who were being neglected and ignored and mistreated. They were being kept in poverty because of whatever corruption was happening at the higher levels. So these are words for us as well, not to be complacent in times of comfort when we think all is going well. When there's a change of government and we might have a bit of a change of perspective, we're still called to be vigilant about what we're seeing as well. Now, also one of the characters in this account from Amos is Amaziah. So on the one hand, you've got the priestly word from Amos, and here is the prophetic word from Amos, and here is Amaziah, who is the priest. And Amaziah didn't even think that Amos was actually a prophet. For Amaziah looked after the shrines, and they were the royal shrines, of course, when the king came as well. So Amaziah was also in cahoots with the king, as it were. I suspect he may not have realised. But he was in bed with the powers and the principalities that was also ruining some people's lives. And in that sense, he was also blindly, perhaps, responsible. Now, we are entrusted with a prophetic gospel, but we're also a priestly people. We're prophetic and we're priestly as well. By that I mean this: that the prophetic gospel is one in which we speak up, in which we enact out, where we speak against the powers and principalities of our time. Some of those are very subtle, some of them are seductive, and we don't realise we're still part of them. How many centuries in Australia has European settlement taken to even get to this point where finally it looks like we might get a voice to Parliament? Perhaps we get a treaty. Christian people, good, one and all, never saw this people as human beings. And yet, here we are now finally beginning to see that our perspective isn't right. This is the prophetic gospel, and it sometimes and usually needs chewing over. It's like the sacrament we take part of. We chew it, we ingest it. Well, the Word of God is like that. We need to do it in such a way that we are leaning into God and what God is calling us to be as individuals, but as a community as well. Too often, though, perhaps like Amaziah, we're more worried about filling the chairs of our church rather than being the hands and feet of Jesus in the needy world. And I realise as a priest and someone in charge of parishes, you get worried when there's empty chairs. You get worried when the plate isn't so full anymore. But we are called to be followers of Jesus and therefore to minister to the needy of the world. So we are a prophetic people, but we're also a priestly people. But let me say another thing before I go on. I'm going ahead of myself. Amos was not thought to be in the company of prophets. In fact, Amaziah had said, "Who are you?" He was not in the company of prophets. He wasn't a trained prophet. He wasn't carrying any fancy title. He was not in church leadership. He was a herdsman and a farmer. God called Amos to then speak. So never think that you necessarily have to be a person of station to hear the voice of God in your life, or to prompt you to measure what is happening around you and to respond appropriately. This is actually the story of the church throughout the years. We could point to the German church and the struggle they had as well through the Second World War, and only a small portion, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were able to see through the German spirituality, which was full of Nazist propaganda and ideology and horror, to see the gospel through that. We might point, for example, at the moment to the patriarch of the Russian church and wonder how on earth could he see the gospel in what is happening there in Russia. Well, it's easy for us outside those situations, but it invites us to be reflective. And again, I get back to the image of art or of the plumb line. We need those things which do prompt us to stop and to rethink. I think if I was the patriarch of Russia and the stakes that are at hand there, I might not be so free to say what I'm saying here. I don't think that lets anyone off the hook, by the way, and no less church leaders, as we've learnt here in Australia. You have to listen to the Spirit in all that. But the priestly side of us is also part of who we are. Now, I think, frankly, Christ, of course, brings all this together. But the priestly side of us, like Amaziah, wants to protect, wants to bring us in together to one, to be community, to be happy together, to be not listening to any ructions that might upset even the powers that be, or the kings that be, or the clergy when they lead, or bishops, whoever. Priests want to see us grow as community. Well, we have to be the sort of community that will grow as community, that will learn to care for each other, but sometimes that caring, not only sometimes, but I think that caring is also where the prophetic witness lies as well. The portrayal of Amaziah gives a face to those people of Israel who refused to turn to God and continued to refuse that the holy place of Bethel was going to face destruction because of who they were and what they were doing. So if we're to be a priestly and prophetic people, we have to find our integrity in terms of who we are. We've been known as a people who have a prophetic voice into the world, onto social media and so on. But we have to also reach back and discover ourselves as priestly people and look for the charisms of care, to be careful about the words we use and the way we use them, to hear that being together as community document and read it as part of our tradition from the gospel and lean into that together, because that's what gives our prophetic voice validity and integrity. So the voice of Amos rings true for us as well, not just for those people out there who are not, whose walls are crooked, who are following a tinny little plumb line. They ring true for us as well. The story of the Good Samaritan is just a great example of the kind of thing that Jesus and the gospel calls us to. It's a great example of the prophetic and the priestly together, of the Good Samaritan, the outsider coming and showing up the clergy and the teachers in their midst in order that those who are in need might be actually dealt with appropriately. Jesus shifts the focus in this parable from the intent of the lawyer's question and his self-justification The issue is no longer love of God and love of neighbour, but exclusively the issue of love of neighbour. And in that, God is found.